A 12-year-old Apache girl runs east toward the sunrise on the fourth morning. Her feet are cracked and bleeding through the moccasin soles. She has not slept in 3 days. Every woman in the camp is singing her forward. She is becoming changing woman. No Hollywood Western ever put this on screen. Not once. Because the real puberty ceremonies that turned children into adults on the American frontier were too sacred, too brutal, and too human for any script. Every culture here had a crossing point where a child's body changed and the community decided what it meant. The movies gave us war paint and screaming. The truth was endurance, faith, and sometimes blood. Which truth about growing up on this frontier did Hollywood work hardest to bury? Now, before we go any further, tap that subscribe button. Stay until the end. Hollywood left out the worst part. We are not going to the movies for this. We are going to the people who were there, the ethnographers who sat in the camps and wrote down what they witnessed. Morris Opler with the Chiricahua Apache in the 1930s. George Catlin with the Mandan on the Upper Missouri in 1832. Alice Fletcher with the Omaha. Frances Densmore with the Lakota. We are going to the letters settler women wrote home about what their daughters faced on the trail, letters that sat in attic trunks for a century before anyone thought to read them. And we are going to the federal records, the laws, the court files, the boarding school enrollment rosters that document what happened when the United States government decided these ceremonies had to end. Some of what follows is physically hard to hear. All of it is sourced. And all of it happened to children, real children on real ground, in a world where nobody had the luxury of waiting until a young person felt ready. On the frontier, there was no adolescence as we understand it. Childhood ended when the land or the community said it ended, and every culture on every side of every line handled that crossing in its own way. Let us start at the bottom with what most people have never stopped to consider, and work our way up to the truth the movies tried hardest to erase. Number 20. Settler boys got no ceremony at all. Not a single one. A boy on an 1850s homestead in Kansas or Nebraska was expected to handle a firearm by age 10. He managed livestock by 12 and did a grown man's full share of fieldwork before his voice changed. There was no ritual to mark it, no recognition from the community, no crossing. Just a pair of dead father's boots handed over on a Tuesday morning after cholera took the man who wore them. Mothers on the Overland Trail wrote about handing sons adult responsibilities the very day after a burial, with the dirt still fresh on the grave. Lodisa Frizzell recorded it in 1852. Amelia Stewart Knight recorded it in 1853. The transition from boy to man was not marked on the settler frontier. It was simply assumed, and the boy was expected to fill shoes that were still warm. Today, we give a boy a graduation ceremony and a cake. On that frontier, he got a shovel and a dead man's chores. Hollywood gave us barefoot boys with fishing rods and golden coming-of-age sunsets on the porch. The truth was a fresh grave and a plow that would not pull itself. Number 19. A girl's first blood on the Oregon Trail was met with silence. Settler girls reached puberty in the back of a covered wagon with no preparation, no explanation, and no ceremony. Menstruation was handled with torn cloth ripped from a worn dress, and absolute shame. There was no spare water for washing, no privacy behind those canvas walls that let in every sound and every pair of eyes. The mother's diaries from the 1840s and 1850s almost never mention it directly, and that silence across hundreds of journals is itself the evidence. Lillian Schlissel spent years studying women's overland diaries and noted the gap where this subject should have been. A 12-year-old girl's body changing into a woman's body was treated as something to be hidden, not a passage to be honored, not a moment to be named. Today, the average American girl learns about puberty in a school classroom with a textbook and a nurse. On the Oregon Trail, she learned from the stain on her skirt and the look on her mother's face. No Western ever showed this. It was too ordinary and too uncomfortable for any camera to linger on. Number 18. Before any ceremony could matter, death had to be survived first. Child mortality on the frontier ran between 20 and 30% before the age of 5. Children as young as 6 helped dig graves for infant brothers and sisters in hard prairie soil with a spade taller than they were. Probate records from Kansas and Nebraska in the 1860s show households where every surviving child was under 14 and running the homestead alone because there was no one else left to do it. Elliot West documented this in his study of frontier childhood. The land did not wait for a child to be ready. It simply took the adults away and left whoever was still breathing to milk the cow and keep the fire lit. Hollywood skipped this entirely. A child burying a sibling before sunrise and then walking back inside to feed the younger ones is not a scene anyone wanted to film. But it happened on that frontier every single week. Growing up meant outliving the ones who did not. Number 17. Along the Texas and New Mexico border, a girl's 15th year was not a party. The quinceañera on the frontier borderlands of the 1850s through 1880s was as much a public announcement of marriageability as a celebration of faith. Families used it to formalize alliances and consolidate ranchland claims along the lower Rio Grande. Parish records from southern New Mexico missions show the ceremony tied directly to courtship negotiations that had already begun weeks before the church doors opened. A girl turned 15 and became a visible piece of the family's survival strategy. The church ceremony was real and the prayers were genuine. But so was the economic calculation behind every invitation and every seat. Arnoldo de Leon documented these borderland customs in his study of Tejano communities. The grand celebration you know today came later, in a gentler and more prosperous century. Number 16. Among the Omaha, there was a ceremony called turning the child. When a child reached a certain age, the tribe performed the Hedawachi. The child's birth moccasins were removed and new ones placed carefully on the feet. This act meant the being who had belonged only to the spirit world now belonged to the earth and to the people who walked on it. Alice Fletcher, who lived among the Omaha in the 1880s and earned their trust across years of patient presence, recorded the ceremony firsthand. She called it one of the most solemn acts she had ever witnessed in any culture. The child was not celebrated the way you might expect. The child was reclassified. From spirit visitor to earthly member, from borrowed soul to full human citizen of the tribe. No American film has ever depicted this. It was too quiet, too deeply theological, and too far from the war paint and feathers Hollywood needed to sell tickets on a Saturday afternoon. We are only 5 entries in, and already the distance between what the movies showed and what actually happened is wide enough to lose a whole wagon train in. Keep your answer in mind. We have a long way still to climb. Number 15. The Lakota ceremony called Isnati Awika Lowanpi, meaning her alone they sing, isolated a girl at her first menstruation in a small teepee set apart from the main camp circle. Elder women attended her day and night and taught her the knowledge she would need to carry into womanhood and motherhood and leadership within the band. The isolation was not shame, it was the direct opposite. The Lakota believed a menstruating woman carried spiritual power so concentrated and so volatile that it could interfere with a warrior's medicine bundle or throw off a hunter's aim at 100 yards. She was set apart not because she was unclean, but because she was too powerful to be near without consequence. Francis Densmore recorded the ceremonial songs in the early 1900s. Marla Powers confirmed the practice and its meaning in her study of Oglala women decades later. That single distinction between dangerous spiritual power and shameful pollution is the one fact Hollywood could never be troubled to understand. Even now, in a culture that spends billions on wellness retreats and spiritual awakenings, we still have not caught up to what the Lakota understood about a girl's first blood before the Civil War. Number 14. A Cheyenne boy, usually between 12 and 15 years old, was taken to an isolated hilltop far from camp and left there alone. No food, no water, no shelter from wind or rain or the cold that dropped across the plains after dark. He stayed up to 4 days, praying without rest, waiting for a vision that would define his adult name, his purpose, and his place among the people. An animal spirit, a voice on the wind, a sign carved into the sky. George Bird Grinnell, who spent decades among the Cheyenne building one of the most careful ethnographic records in American history, documented boys who came dangerously close to death from dehydration and exposure during these quests. This was not a metaphor taught around a campfire. It was a real child on real ground in real weather, waiting for something sacred to speak, or for the silence to break him first. The courage this demanded of a boy barely old enough to shave is something no casting director in Hollywood ever wanted to put honestly on a screen. Number 13. The Navajo Kinaaldá is one of the most physically demanding puberty ceremonies documented anywhere on the North American continent. At her first menstruation, a Navajo girl rose before dawn and ran east toward the rising sun, increasing the distance each morning across 4 consecutive days. Between the runs, she ground corn by hand on a stone matat, for hours at a stretch without complaint. On the final night, the entire community helped bake a massive ceremonial corn cake in a pit dug into the earth, and the girl stayed awake through the full darkness to tend it. Charlotte Frisbie documented families still practicing the complete Kinaaldá in the 1960s. Despite a full century of outside pressure to abandon it, the girl was not simply growing up. She was becoming changing woman, the most sacred figure in Navajo cosmology. Today, roughly 170,000 Navajo people live on the reservation. The Kinaaldá is still performed. It survived the missionaries. It survived the federal ban. It survived the boarding schools. It survived everything that was ever thrown against it. Number 12. During the Apache sunrise ceremony, the girl's sponsor, a respected older woman chosen carefully by the family, physically pressed and molded the girl's body with her hands. She shaped the limbs, corrected the posture, smoothed the form from head to foot. Morris Opler, who spent years living among the Chiricahua Apache in the 1930s, recording traditions from elders who remembered the old life, documented this practice in close and unflinching detail. The belief was that during the 4 days of the ceremony, the girl's body became as soft and malleable as it had been at the moment of her birth. The sponsor was not symbolically blessing the girl. She was literally shaping her into the woman she would become, pressing the sacred potential into physical form. The contact was firm, sustained, and understood by everyone present as an act of profound spiritual transformation. It is among the most intimate puberty rituals ever documented anywhere on this continent. No film has ever come within 1,000 miles of showing it honestly. Number 11. Among the Comanche, horsemanship was not a skill you learned. It was identity itself. A boy's path toward manhood was measured by one test above all others. Could he catch, rope, and break a wild Mustang alone? The process was violent and unforgiving. Boys were thrown from the horse's back onto hard ground, trampled under hooves, dragged by a rope wrapped around the wrist, and left with cracked ribs and broken bones before they were old enough to grow a beard. Ernest Wallace and E. Adamson Hobel, drawing on direct interviews with Comanche elders in the 1930s, documented this as one of the defining ordeals of readiness for adult life. A boy who could not master a horse could not ride in a raid. He could not hunt buffalo from horseback. He could not marry well or provide for a family. The stakes were not ceremonial abstractions. They were economic, military, and social, all bound together in the body of one horse and one boy. Hollywood loved the image of the Comanche warrior at full gallop. It never once showed the 12-year-old getting his ribs cracked by the animal that would eventually make him one. Halfway through now, and every single thing you have heard so far is documented, sourced, and real, but we have not reached the answer yet. The truth Hollywood worked hardest to bury is still ahead of us. Hold your guess just a little longer. Number 10. In 1832, the painter George Catlin traveled up the Missouri River and witnessed the Okipa ceremony of the Mandan people at their village near the mouth of the Knife River. Young men who had fasted for days were pierced through the skin of the chest and the back with sharpened wooden skewers. They were then lifted off the ground and suspended from the roof of the ceremonial lodge by rawhide thongs attached to those skewers, hanging by their own torn flesh, while the entire village gathered below to watch and pray and sing. Catlin painted exactly what he saw, in vivid and unflinching color. When he brought those paintings east and exhibited them in New York and London, the scholar Henry Schoolcraft publicly accused him of inventing the entire spectacle for profit. Catlin spent years of his life defending the truth of his own eyes. It was Prince Maximilian of Wied, a German naturalist who visited the Mandan independently, who confirmed every major detail of the ceremony. 5 years after Catlin's visit, the devastating smallpox epidemic of 1837 nearly erased the Mandan from the earth entirely. The ceremony outlasted the men who doubted it. The people who performed it almost did not, and the paintings that proved it was real still hang in a museum where anyone with eyes can see exactly what Catlin saw. Number 9. The sun dance, practiced in various forms across the Plains nations, including the Lakota, Cheyenne, Arapaho, and Crow, included, for those young men who freely chose it, a piercing ordeal that still commands silence when you read the accounts. Wooden skewers were inserted beneath the skin of the chest or the upper back. The young man then danced for hours or even days, pulling backward against rawhide tethers attached to those skewers until his own flesh finally tore free and released him. This was not punishment. It was not imposed by elders or forced on anyone. It was volunteered. A young man's offering of his own suffering as a prayer to the sacred, often made in fulfillment of a vow spoken during a moment of desperate crisis. George Dorsey documented the Arapaho version of the sun dance in 1903 with the precision of a man who understood what he was recording. The scars left behind were never hidden. They were displayed openly for the rest of that man's life. They carried a message no spoken word could match. I gave something of myself that can never be taken back. Showing these men as genuinely devout rather than simply savage was something Hollywood was never once prepared to do. Number 8. Across the plains and the Southwest, the crossing from child to adult was written permanently into the skin itself. Tattooing with bone needles and charcoal ink pressed beneath the flesh. Scarification with deliberate cuts that healed into raised ridges and lines, mapping a young person's new place in the world. Among the Osage, certain tattoo patterns were strictly restricted to individuals who had completed specific ceremonial stages in the proper order. Among the Wichita, elaborate facial tattooing of women was recorded with astonishment by nearly every European and American observer who ever laid eyes on them. The body was the only document that could not be burned or confiscated. The skin was the archive. And when the boarding schools arrived decades later, one of the very first things the administrators targeted was those visible marks. They cut the hair on the first morning. They scrubbed at tattoos with lye soap and rough brushes. They set about erasing the sacred record that a community had written onto the body of its own child. You could take a child from a reservation. You could cut his hair and burn his clothes and forbid his language. But the marks under his skin told anyone who knew how to read them exactly who he was and where he came from. That is why they had to go. Number 7. Return now to the Apache sunrise ceremony, this time at the raw level of physical endurance. The girl danced from sunset to sunrise for 4 consecutive nights, her feet moving to the rhythm of the medicine singers chanting while the fire burned low and the stars turned overhead. During the days she ran east at dawn, was physically molded by her sponsor, and received sacred instruction from the women of her family. Real sleep was almost non-existent across the full 4 days. By that 4th morning run, her body was at the very edge of what a human being can sustain. And still, she ran. Jason Betzinez, a Chiricahua Apache who survived the wars and the reservation era and lived long enough to tell his story, described watching his own female relatives go through this ceremony with his own eyes. He called it flatly one of the most demanding things he had ever seen any human being do. Eve Ball recorded similar accounts from Apache elders in the 1950s and 60s. 4 days without true rest. And on the last morning, the girl still ran east toward a sunrise that belonged to her now. Number 6. This is the entry I need you to hold on to. Not every vision quest succeeded. A boy could endure the fasting, the isolation, the wind and cold and blazing sun, and come back with nothing. No animal spirit appeared. No voice spoke from the dark. No sign revealed itself in the shape of a cloud or the cry of a hawk. He returned to camp, and the silence that greeted him when the others saw his face was its own verdict. Among the Lakota, a failed quest did not permanently destroy a boy, but it delayed everything that mattered: his standing among the young men, his ability to join a war party, his prospects for a marriage that would honor his family. He could try again the following summer, but the gap between boyhood and the recognition of manhood could stretch into years of quiet, painful limbo that no one in camp openly discussed. The ethnographers recorded the triumphant visions because those were the stories people wanted to tell. The boys who came back with empty hands and empty eyes were written out of the record before it ever reached paper. Remember number 6. We are coming back to it. 5 entries left, and now the countdown changes direction entirely. Because the most disturbing truths about puberty ceremonies on the American frontier are not about what the ceremonies demanded of a child's body. They are about what was deliberately done to destroy them. Number 5. Christian missionaries stationed on the reservations in the 1870s and 1880s identified puberty ceremonies as the single most critical point of cultural transmission between generations. The exact moment when a child was bound permanently to the old ways and the old faith. And they were right. They understood precisely what they were looking at. Because they understood it, they attacked these ceremonies with focused, strategic, and relentless intensity. Presbyterian, Catholic, Methodist, and Episcopalian mission stations pressured families to withhold daughters from the sunrise ceremony. They condemned the vision quest openly as pagan delusion and spiritual danger. They offered food, trade goods, clothing, and schooling to families who agreed to abandon the old rites and keep their children away from the ceremonial ground. Robert Keller documented this coordinated campaign in his study of American Protestantism and government Indian policy. The missionaries were not blundering through ignorance. They had studied the structure and knew exactly where it was weakest. Break the chain at the crossing point between childhood and adulthood, and the entire system of belief collapses within a single generation. They very nearly proved themselves right. And the families who resisted paid the price in food withheld, children taken, and futures quietly dismantled one ceremony at a time. Number 4. In 1883, Secretary of the Interior Henry Teller issued the Code of Indian Offenses. It established courts of Indian offenses on reservations across the West and explicitly targeted what the official document called heathenish dances and ceremonies. Reservation-appointed judges, men often hand-picked by the local Indian agent for their willingness to cooperate, were given the authority to sentence ceremony participants to 30 days of hard labor or to withhold rations from their families. The sun dance was named as a primary target. The sunrise ceremony was suppressed wherever Indian agents had enough manpower to enforce the order. A mother or father who allowed a child to take part in a traditional puberty ceremony could be hauled before a court and punished under federal authority. This was not disapproval expressed in a letter. It was law, enforced by men who held the power to decide whether your family would eat that week or go hungry. Today, roughly 5.2 million Americans identify as Native American or Alaska Native. The code that criminalized their most sacred ceremonies remained in force until 1934. Over 50 years of ceremony as a federal crime. Number 3. Richard Henry Pratt founded the Carlisle Indian Industrial School in the state of Pennsylvania in 1879, with a philosophy he stated openly and without apology: kill the Indian in him and save the man. Children as young as 5 years old were taken from their families on reservations and transported hundreds of miles to institutional boarding schools where everything familiar was stripped away on the first day. They arrived at exactly the age when puberty ceremonies would have begun. Their hair was cut with shears within hours of walking through the door. Their clothing was confiscated and burned. Their languages were forbidden under threat of physical punishment for a single spoken word. The Apache sunrise ceremony requires an entire community of women, singers, and a medicine man working together across 4 days. The vision quest requires elders who know the boy, who prepare him, and who can interpret whatever vision he brings back from the hilltop. Remove the child from the community before puberty arrives, and the ceremony does not simply pause. It has no one to happen to. By the 1890s, more than 10,000 Native children were enrolled in off-reservation boarding schools spread across the country. David Wallace Adams documented this system and its consequences in devastating detail. A full generation of sacred crossings simply never took place. The chain was broken at exactly the link the missionaries had identified. Number 2. And here is what Hollywood built to fill the silence left behind. The war dance. You know the image even if you have never thought about where it came from. Figures circling a fire in buckskin, pounding drums in a rising frenzy, whooping with painted faces turned toward the night sky. That image appeared in hundreds of Western films from the 1930s through the 1970s, and it was a pure studio invention from the very first frame to the very last. John Ford's Stagecoach in 1939. They Died with Their Boots On in 1941. The Searchers in 1956. In film after film after film, the full depth and variety of Native ceremony was crushed down into a single repeating image of wildness and threat, designed for one purpose only: to justify the cavalry charge that came in the next reel. The sunrise ceremony never appeared. The Kinaaldá never appeared. The vision quest and the sun dance never appeared. What appeared in their place was a fiction so complete and so relentless that 3 full generations of Americans grew up believing that Native coming of age meant war paint and a scream around a fire. The studios did not merely get it wrong through carelessness. They replaced a living sacred tradition with a racial weapon aimed directly at the people who still practiced it in secret. And the audience never knew the difference because no one told them there was one. Number 1. The ceremonies survived. That is the most disturbing truth on this list, and it is disturbing because of what the survival cost. The Apache Sunrise Dance is still performed today on the Mescalero Reservation in southern New Mexico and at San Carlos in Arizona. The Navajo Kinaaldá continues across the Navajo Nation. The Sun Dance returned openly to the northern plains only after the American Indian Religious Freedom Act of 1978, nearly a full century after it was made a crime. For all those decades in between, families kept the sacred knowledge alive in hidden places, passed it in whispers, practiced the old forms at personal risk, knowing that discovery could mean jail time, confiscated rations, or the forced removal of their children to a school designed to make them forget everything their grandmothers had taught them. The survival of these ceremonies is not a comfortable ending to this story. It is the clearest possible measure of the scale of what was attempted against an entire people's way of raising their children. For 50 years and more, families chose ceremony over safety, tradition over government compliance, and their children's sacred crossing over the approval of every institution that held power over their daily lives. Some of them paid for that choice with their freedom. Some of them paid with their children. The timeline tells you everything you need to know. Ceremonies practiced openly for centuries. Missionaries target them in the 1870s. Federal criminalization in 1883. Systematic boarding school removal through the 1880s and 1900s. A half-century of underground survival in secret. Legal protection restored only in 1978. That is not legend or interpretation. That is documented policy, preserved in the annual reports of the Commissioner of Indian Affairs, in Henry Teller's own official correspondence, in Richard Henry Pratt's published speeches and self-promoting pamphlets, and in the ration ledgers that recorded week by week which reservation families were fed and which were deliberately starved into silence. The paper trail is not hidden. It is sitting in archives waiting for anyone who cares enough to look. 3 hands shape the false version that most Americans still carry in their heads. First, the policymakers. Teller, Pratt, and the Indian agents who enforced the bans and kept the paper trail that now proves every single word of what they did. Second, the studio system. John Ford, the Warner Brothers Western unit, and every casting director who hired a white actor darkened his skin and told him to dance a ceremony that never existed anywhere outside a Los Angeles soundstage. Third, the silence that lasted longest of all. The school textbooks that taught the American frontier to children for over 100 years without once printing the word Kinaaldá, without once describing a sunrise dance, without once explaining what a vision quest asked of a 12-year-old boy alone on a hilltop. 3 generations of Americans filled that textbook silence with whatever Hollywood was willing to sell them. And all Hollywood was willing to sell them was war paint and noise. So here is my answer to the question I planted at the very start of this video. The most disturbing truth about puberty ceremonies that Hollywood never showed was not the flesh piercing. It was not the 4-day endurance. It was not the fasting or the bleeding feet or the sleepless nights. It was the faith. Go back to number 6, the boy who climbed the hill and fasted and prayed and came home with nothing. No vision, no voice, no sign. He sat in silence while the others were honored. He is the one who never made it into any ethnographer's book, any museum exhibit, any film. He is this frontier's most honest truth about growing up. Sometimes the crossing fails. Sometimes the ceremony does not deliver what it promises. And the quiet that follows is the heaviest burden any child on any frontier has ever had to carry home. But someone in that boy's family looked at his empty face and still sent the next child up the same hill the following summer. And the family after that did the same. They kept doing it when the missionaries said it was sin. They kept doing it when the government made it a crime. They kept doing it when the boarding schools took their children away before the ceremony could reach them. They held the crossing open year after year because they believed it mattered more than their own safety, more than their own comfort, and more than the approval of every powerful institution that wanted it gone. That is the truth. No movie has ever had the courage or the decency to put on screen. Not the pain. The faith that the pain was worth something, and the people who proved it by never letting go. Which truth changed the way you will watch every Western from now on? Tell me down below. And if you want the real story behind another piece of frontier life the movies got wrong, the next one is already waiting for you right now.